Hi, and welcome back to Authentically ADHD. I am your host, Carmen. I'm a late diagnosed ADHDer, an early childhood special educator, and a certified life and performance coach. I created this podcast to help as many ADHDers as I could to learn about your specific ADHD. I know that when I was late diagnosed, I was sent out the door with meds and no help. We have to do a lot of this work on our own, but if we join together in community, we can live more authentically and with more joy in our lives. Are you ready? Let's get started. Hi, my friends, and welcome back to Authentically ADHD with me, your host, Carmen. Today, we are diving into a topic or a feeling that so many of us with ADHD know all too well: shame. It's that sinking, heavy sensation in your gut, or that voice in your head whispering that you're not good enough, you always mess things up, or what's wrong with you. Shame can feel literally paralyzing, but it really doesn't have to control us. I let it control me for way too long. So let's start by breaking it down. First of all, let's get the difference between shame and guilt, because a lot of people confuse shame with guilt, but they're actually very different. Guilt is it's about what we actually do. So it's when we make a mistake, recognize it, and then feel bad about that action. Guilt can actually be helpful because it signals that we need to make amends or change something or do something different. Shame, on the other hand, is about who we are. Instead of saying, I did something bad, shame says, I am bad. It's a deep internalized belief that often there's something inherently wrong with us. For people with ADHD, shame often comes from years of struggling to meet expectations, whether that's in school, at work, in relationships, etc. It's an accumulation of messages, both explicit and subtle, that tell us we're too much, not enough, or that we just don't measure up. So how does this show up in our ADHD day-to-day lives? Because ADHD comes with executive functioning challenges like difficulty with organization, memory, and emotional regulation and impulse control, many of us grow up hearing things like, why can't you just focus? Or you're so lazy? Or if you just tried harder, you wouldn't struggle this hard. These repeated experiences of falling short, being criticized, or feeling like we just can't trust our own brains lead to shame and lack of self-trust. And it doesn't just stay in our childhood. It follows us into adulthood, shaping how we see ourselves and interact with the world. Here's what that can look like: over-apologizing for things that aren't even your fault, avoiding challenges because you assume you will fail, people-pleasing to try to make up for shortcomings, self-sabotage, procrastinating or giving up before you even try, hiding your struggles because you're afraid of judgment, aka masking. Let me tell you a quick story about my own life. I remember in high school I had a big research paper due. I had every intention of doing it. I even picked a topic and I was excited about it. But by the time it just got away from me, I was time blind. I didn't know it. I procrastinated, lost track of deadlines, and the night before it was due, I realized I had not written a single word. I panicked. Instead of pulling an all-nighter or at least trying to scrape something together, I shut down. I convinced myself that turning in nothing was better than turning in something bad. The next day, when my teacher called me out on it, I felt so much shame. Not because I didn't do the work, but because I believed that I was the kind of person who would just always mess up. I wasn't someone who just forgot a paper. I was irresponsible, lazy, and a failure. That stuck with me for years, but it was just a feeling. But every time I had a deadline, that shame resurfaced, whispering, you'll probably mess this up too. And the worst part, that belief made me more likely to self-sabotage again and again, reinforcing the very thing I was afraid of. If you can relate to that, I want you to know you are not alone and you're not broken. Shame is a learned response, and just like we can learn it, we can unlearn it. But the first step is recognizing it for what it is. In the next section, we're going to talk about why people with ADHD feel shame so intensely, what rejection sensitivity has to do with it, and more. But before we get there, I want you to take a deep breath. If you're carrying shame from past mistakes, know this: you are not your struggles. ADHD is a part of you, but it does not define your self-worth. Okay? All right, let's keep going. Why does shame feel so intense for us as ADHD individuals? Now that we've explored what shame is and how it manifests, let's talk about why people with ADHD feel it so intensely. Because if you've ever wondered, why do I take things so personally? Or why does one mistake make me feel like an absolute failure? This is for you. The science of shame in ADHD. First, we're going to get into the why, the neurobiology and psychological reasons that make shame hit differently for us. ADHD is not just about attention. It's a condition that affects how our brains regulate emotions. People with ADHD have differences in our prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for executive functioning, emotional regulation, and impulse control. We also have lower levels of dopamine, the neurotransmitter that helps us with motivation, pleasure, and reward processing. When dopamine is low, we're more prone to emotional dysregulation, which means that feelings like frustration, embarrassment, or shame hit us harder and they linger longer. On top of that, many of us experience rejection-sensitive dysphoria, or RSD. It's what is referred to as, but it's really just rejection sensitivity. It's a heightened emotional response to real or perceived rejection. It's not just about feeling disappointed. It can feel like an emotional devastation. And because rejection and shame are so closely linked, this makes us especially vulnerable to spiraling into self-blame. So, how does our executive functioning challenges fuel our shame? This is because it's where shame really builds up over time. Executive functioning is basically the brain's management system. It controls things like organization, remembering important deadlines, regulating emotions, controlling impulses, planning, and prioritizing. When these systems don't work in the way that they should, we experience failures that feel super personal. But these failures aren't because we're lazy or because we don't care. They're because our brains process information and motivation differently. And when we don't meet our expectations, whether it's forgetting an appointment, missing a deadline, or blurting something out impulsively, that shame starts to creep in. And we start to think, why am I like this? Why can't I just get it together? Everyone else seems to handle it just fine. What's wrong with me? That negative self-talk compounds over time, turning small mistakes into deeply held beliefs about our self-worth. So there's a few different triggers, common and uncommon, that trigger ADHD shame. It can come from all different kinds of experiences, but some obvious and some are more subtle. Some common shame triggers are forgetfulness, like missing deadlines, appointments, or losing important items. Impulsivity, saying or doing things without thinking it and then regretting it. Underperformance, feeling like you're not living up to your potential despite trying your absolute best. Rejection and criticism, taking negative feedback as proof of personal failure. And emotional dysregulation, reacting too much to situations and then feeling embarrassed afterwards. Some uncommon but very real shame triggers that go along with ADHD are masking and pretending to be somebody who's quote-unquote normal. That exhaustion of trying to hide ADHD struggles leads to shame when you slip up. Asking for help, feeling ashamed that you need accommodations, support, or changes. Success and good days. Sounds weird, right? But sometimes when we finally do well, we actually feel shame for not being able to do well all the time. It's kind of a catch-22, but we can get out of it. Lazy activities. Feeling guilty for needing downtime even though rest is essential. Being called out for not trying hard enough, when in reality, we're often trying harder than anyone realizes. So, here's the thing. When we feel shame, our instinct is often to withdraw, hide, or beat ourselves up. But this will just keep us stuck in a loop. For example, say you forgot your friend's birthday. Instead of reaching out later and apologizing, shame makes you avoid it entirely. And now, not only do you feel bad about forgetting, but you also feel guilty for not making it right. That's the shame cycle. But here's the truth. ADHD is not a character flaw. The way our brains function is not determined by our worth. The first step is breaking free from shame, is recognizing that many of us struggle with the same things, and many of those struggles are symptoms of a neurological condition, not a reflection of who we are as people. In the next section, we're going to talk a little bit more about rejection sensitivity and how it amplifies the feelings of shame even more. But for now, take a deep breath, let go of some of that weight you've been carrying, and remember, shame is learned, and that means we can unlearn it too. Let's hear a word from our sponsors. Hi. Did you know that Patreon helps podcasters like me through listener support? That's right. By joining the Patreon, not only do you get so many of my resources, early release to episodes, and free coaching, you're also supporting the cost of creating the podcast that you love listening to. Let's start building our own ADHD community today in my Patreon. The link is down in the show notes. Hope to see you over there. Okay, now back to the show. All right, so now we're going to talk about something that so many of us with ADHD experience, even if we don't have the words for it. Rejection sensitivity. This is a huge part of the shame puzzle piece. And this is because for many of us, even the smallest hint of rejection can feel devastating. And when that happens, shame isn't far behind. So let's break this down. What is rejection sensitivity and how does it show up in our lives? And why does it make shame feel so much worse? Rejection sensitivity is an extreme emotional response to real or perceived rejection, criticism, or failure. It's overwhelming. It's a painful reaction that can feel like deep emotional wounds. For many of us, it's not just about external rejection, but it can also be triggered by self-imposed standards, and we beat ourselves up for not meeting our own very high expectations, for quote-unquote failing at things that others may be able to seem to handle with ease. So now let's connect the dots between rejection sensitivity and shame. We experience rejection more intensely, so our brains process rejection as threatening, like we're being completely excluded or abandoned. This reaction isn't just emotional, it's neurological. Studies suggest that people with ADHD have lower levels of dopamine, which plays a role in how we regulate our emotions and handle social feedback. Because of this, rejection literally hurts more for us than for neurotypical people. We are hyper-aware of social cues. You ever replay a conversation over and over in your head, convinced that you said something embarrassing? That's us at work. Our brains are wired to search for rejection, even when it's not even there. And we internalize rejection as shame. Instead of thinking that person disagreed with me, we think they don't like me, I'm annoying. Instead of thinking I'll forget that deadline, we think I'm a failure and I'll never get it together. Over time, this creates a cycle where we just start anticipating rejection, which really just leads to avoiding opportunities where we might fail, overanalyzing social situations and interactions, people-pleasing to avoid conflict, and shut down or withdraw when we feel criticized. Guess what? Each of these reactions reinforces shame, and we feel it stronger. Rejection sensitivity doesn't just happen in big dramatic moments either. It sneaks into everyday life. Here are a few scenarios. 1, work or school. Your boss or teacher gives you criticism, but all you hear is, you're not good enough. You immediately spiral into self-doubt and shame instead of seeing the feedback as a chance to improve. You start avoiding situations where you might be critiqued, which limits your growth opportunities. Then there's in friendships and social interactions. You text a friend and they don't reply right away. Instead of thinking they're probably busy, your brain jumps to, they don't like me anymore, and you feel ashamed for being too much. Instead of reaching out, you then withdraw and isolate. The friendship fades, reinforcing the fear that people just leave you. Then there's romantic relationships. Your partner seems distracted or distant, and you immediately assume that you did something wrong. You start apologizing unnecessarily and overcompensating to fix something that might not even be broken. The constant fear of rejection leads to an emotional exhaustion for both of you, and that's not good for anybody. Then there's public speaking or even sharing ideas. You share an idea at a meeting or a group chat and no one responds right away. Instead of thinking, maybe they didn't see it or haven't had time to process it yet, you assume, I must have just said something really stupid. You decide to stop sharing your ideas altogether to avoid that again. We need to break this cycle in order to move forward. If you haven't gotten that hint yet, getting stuck in these cycles isn't going to get you anywhere. If you're listening to this and thinking, wow, this is me, you're really not alone. It is real and it's not your fault. The first step is managing rejection sensitivity and the shame that comes with it, and recognizing it for what it is, a heightened emotional reaction, not a reflection of your worth. We are going to dive into some strategies for managing shame, including ways to reframe rejection, regulate emotions, and build resilience so you don't let shame and rejection sensitivity control your life. So, shame thrives in the shadows. It's very sneaky. It disguises itself as other emotions like frustration, guilt, and even anger. And if we don't catch it early enough, it can spiral into a full-blown shame attack, where we're stuck in self-blame, withdrawing from others, or feeling like we're fundamentally not good enough. So we're going to outline common signs of shame, why self-awareness and mindfulness are key to breaking that cycle, and practical strategies to help you recognize shame before it escalates. So, some common signs of shame: over-apologizing and people-pleasing, harsh self-talk and perfectionism, avoidance and procrastination, defensive reactions, and physical reactions. Shame is not just emotional, it's physical too. You might feel a tight chest or stomach drop, or an urge to hide or escape, or a hot flash of embarrassment that takes over your whole body. You might even feel unworthy or like an imposter. You might struggle to accept compliments, thinking they don't really mean that, or you feel like a fraud, convinced at any moment people will realize you're not as competent as they think you are. You believe that no matter what, it's never enough. This is why the power of self-awareness and mindfulness can help shame lose its grip. We need to bring shame into the light. Self-awareness and mindfulness are so powerful. I thought this was really woo-woo when I first heard about it, but they really help us notice shame before it fully takes over. Here's how we can recognize shame in the moment. Pause and name it. When you feel a wave of embarrassment, self-criticism, or rejection, take a second to ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? Is this shame? And what triggered this reaction? Sometimes just naming the feeling can reduce its intensity. Check the story you're telling yourself. Shame often comes from distorted thinking, the idea that one mistake can define us forever. Instead of thinking, I'm a failure, try, I made a mistake and I can learn from this. Instead of, they must be mad at me, ask, is this actually true, or is this just my ADHD brain talking? Notice shame in your body. Remember, shame is also physical. Pay attention to the physical feelings in your body that signal shame for you. For me, my face flushes hot and I feel the urge to escape. What does it feel like for you? When you feel these sensations, pause and take a deep breath. You are not your shame. It is a feeling and it will pass. Ask yourself, what would I say to a friend? If your best friend made the same mistake, what would you tell them? You wouldn't tell them you're worthless. Talk to yourself with the same compassion you would offer somebody you love. Here are some practical strategies for catching shame early. Create a shame awareness journal. Jot down moments when shame hits you and look for the patterns. What triggers you most? Use a shame safe word. Pick a phrase like shame storm or brain gremlins to signal to yourself when shame is creeping in. Practice zooming out and asking yourself, will this still matter a month from now? Most of the time, the answer is no. Have a shame buddy. Someone you trust who can remind you, hey, this isn't about your worth, you're just having a bad day. Use a mantra, something simple like I am worthy, I am not my mistakes, this feeling will pass, and I am worthy even when I mess up works. Shame can feel overwhelming, but it does not have to control you. Cultivating self-compassion and awareness and the ability to live in the moment, the more we can recognize it, the less power it has. We are going to explore 7 powerful strategies to manage and reduce shame in everyday life so we can stop letting it hold us back and start living with more confidence and self-acceptance. So, want to know one of the biggest ways to counteract shame? Self-compassion. Try to practice it daily. Build emotional resilience. Strengthen that shame shield. Educate others. Change the narrative around ADHD and shame. Be open about your experiences. Use resources and set boundaries. Make sure you're creating support networks to know that you're not alone. Find the right support system. Join an ADHD support group. Surround yourself with safe people and consider ADHD coaching. A coach can help you navigate shame and build confidence in practical and personalized ways. Set realistic expectations and ditch the perfectionism. Use the good enough rule. Instead of trying to do everything perfectly, ask yourself, is this good enough for now? Always aim for progress, not perfection. Celebrate the small wins. Our brains thrive on dopamine. Celebrating small successes helps build that momentum. Develop coping strategies. Manage shame in real time. When shame hits, make sure you have those go-to coping strategies that can help it stop from spiraling out of control. And seek professional support. You don't have to do this alone. There is zero shame in getting help. Therapy and counseling can be game changers for those working through deep-seated shame patterns. I hope that this episode has helped you because shame is a tough opponent, but it is not unbeatable. The more we build self-compassion, resilience, and support systems, the less power it has over us. Remember, as you move forward, you are not your mistakes. You are worthy even when you struggle, and you're not alone in this. That is all I have for now, my friends. Stay authentic, and we will talk soon.